Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome to Fish University. You know, every lake is different. Sure, we have scientifically proven approaches to lake and pond management that we recommend, but there's always an element of art involved. There's usually something just a little bit different that needs to be considered, or a unique issue that each lake may have that needs to be addressed. Today, we're going to take an in-depth look at a lake that fits this description. This is a lake built in a deep erosion valley of the Mississippi River escarpment area that has faced watershed issues, plant management issues, and fisheries management issues for some time. But with proper management and attention to detail, the lake is getting back on track. My guest today is Mr. Jeffrey Clark, whose family owns the lake and has been battling its issues. Jeffrey, how are you doing?
Wes, good morning. I'm doing great, thank you. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing wonderful. It's finally starting to feel like fall out there. And
yeah, we've got a change in weather coming up this week that's really going to remind us that fall's in the air for sure. How have you been hunting any so far this year?
I hunted quite a bit with crossbow early. Actually, it was one of my more successful years. I went out 5 times and brought home 3 does.
Oh, there you go.
And I'm looking forward to the potential for frost finally, because it's just been so hot. The mosquitoes have been terrible.
Yeah, it'll shake things up. I have been in the last 2 weeks with my crossbow as well. And I need to upgrade my crossbow. My range is limited with this old bow, but I've managed to take out 2 does and 1 pig, and that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm lacking the pigs still. That's the one thing I need to find.
Yeah, well, we can't kill enough of them, and I may need your help. Come down to our place and take a few out.
So let's talk a little bit about your place, because it's a really beautiful piece of property, kind of right on the edge of what we call the Mississippi River escarpment, or the lowest hills, as people refer to it. Tell us a little bit about the property and its history.
It really is a unique piece of property, especially in Mississippi. Our property, Wes, is broken out with really 2 different personalities. We call it the upper and the lower. And the upper looks like traditional Mississippi countryside. It's flat. We've got a mixture of oak trees and pine trees. We've got fields, and it's very traditional. But the lower half of our property is a completely different animal and doesn't look like it belongs in the state of Mississippi at all. It's our property's positioned in southwest Mississippi in between Natchez and Vicksburg, and it parallels the Mississippi River, and goodness knows how many hundreds of years ago that river just carved out this embankment area. The ravines that we have they're steep, they're aggressive, and once you go down the ravine from the upper part of our property, you enter a beautiful cypress swamp. Covers about half of our lower land, and then it's just traditional floodland. And when I say traditional floodland, there's a lot of cypress trees that are in the area, as you can imagine, a lot of water oak trees, a lot of hardwood acorn producing trees that are in there. So it holds the wildlife really nice in there. We'll see a flood every few years that will flood just about 100% of our lower land from the Mississippi River. But as you can imagine, or as you know, that river has just left such a rich deposit of soil. It has left so many ravines. It's special. It's really unique.
Yeah, let's talk about those ravines, because a lot of folks that listen to this podcast probably are not familiar with what the escarpment in the lowest area is. You know, picture this big river that's meandering through its floodplain, carving into the hills of Mississippi, and then back, what was it, the Pleistocene era, I believe, the glacial activity up north created all this sediment and fine particulate matter And during that period, I think there was a lot of dust storms that were happening, and the dust storms blew all this material across the Mississippi, and it deposited it on, this hill country. So you get areas that are this lowest soil that is deposited in, up to 90, 100 feet deep in places. And for years, trees grew on it. It was pretty stable. And then I guess, when we showed up a few hundred years ago, or maybe just 100 years, 150 years ago, we said, hey, this is some rich soil. I bet this would be great farming country. And what do? We cut down the trees and we tried to plant crops. Well, this stuff is just really fine soil. And when you cut down all the trees that hold it in place, we had pretty bad erosion. So the erosion gullies that are on that escarpment are incredible. I mean, it's some of the steepest country you can find, and Mississippi is not a steep state in any stretch of the imagination. So, you get these really sharp gullies that run down through the hillside, and then they run into the valleys, and that's where your lake is at, right? It's down in one of the valleys with all these steep gullies running into it. So it's kind of just really unusual for the state of Mississippi because you've got this deep lake, but the lake is in a deep valley with high hillsides on both sides of it, kind of a sheltered system.
Yeah, a little history of that lake is I'm blessed to have a father much smarter than I am, for sure. He's a civil engineer by background, and his career was a builder. And he studied that topo map inside and out. And he's actually the person who built the lake. And Dad was looking at that, and he was thinking, well, it's going to be deep in the center. We'll see how this goes. And our lake probably, well, I know it does. It has between 27 and 30 feet deep in most of the center of the lake throughout it. It's 36 to 38 acres. It has about 1,200 acres of watershed. So when you dam up a ravine, you've got a tremendous amount of volume of watershed that's flowing into it. So we knew we would have a few problems or challenges going into it, but goodness, the blessings have far outweighed the curses of that lake, for sure. But we've learned a lot along the way managing that lake.
What year was it built?
Construction started on that lake in, I think, 2006, and that was after all the paperwork was done and processed with the Corps of Engineers and many others. That took quite a while for us to get approval. But probably 2006 is when construction started. It did not take the lake too long to fill up. It did take a while to clear cut that valley within the ravine. It was really great in the sense that we were able to leave so much of the hardwood and the stumps to serve as structure along the way, in addition to the different tiers of the depth. So the lake has structure. We certainly had a nice head start in that regard. But after the lake filled up, we probably stocked it around 2009 with brim, and I think we had bluegill, we had red ear, we had golden shiners that we had put in there originally. And I want to say, Wes, we waited about 1 year before we introduced F1 bass in the lake. It was probably a year later. So that 2010 to 2011 timeline, we had a new balanced lake.
And the fishing was pretty good prior to some of the problems that came in later on.
Oh, goodness, yeah. I mean, we were naive to one thing. We were celebrating how awesome the bass were growing. I mean, it was a pound a year, if not a little bit more. And in 2015, I was looking back at pictures, and we were holding 4-pound bass, 5-pound bass, and a bunch of them. And there's one picture Dad and I had strung up. I don't know, it was so many fish, and they probably averaged 2.5 to 3 pounds. And it was just, we were hammering them. We really were. But the one thing that we failed to really pay attention to was we were not as disciplined as we should have been in terms of harvesting the bass out as they were growing. We thought we had just hit the jackpot, and this is the best bass lake in the whole wide world. But yeah, we hit a stumbling block by not being aggressive enough and keeping enough fish per year.
Your big fish were probably the fish that were stocked originally or their immediate offspring, but then you started to fill the pond up with young fish and you weren't aggressively taking out those smaller bass.
That's exactly right. We were not on a disciplined plan at all at that point. We didn't know how many pounds per acre. We weren't even thinking, along those lines of how many fish we needed to harvest and pull out so the big fish could get bigger and so that we could maintain that balance of the brim, which really have been the backbone of that lake in terms of the bass feeding. We didn't understand the science behind it. We were really in celebration mode and fishing when it was convenient and keeping what we felt like cleaning. And, we didn't have that other side of the equation in our minds.
Did you have shad in it at that time?
No, we didn't. But it's interesting you're mentioning that. We did not originally stock any shad at all. I don't know exactly the time. I need to check with my dad on this. But around that peak of catching 3 to 5 pound bass, and a lot of them, right before that lake started to decline, we introduced a few gizzard shad, and that ended up being a problem for us. In hindsight, I wish we had introduced threadfin shad. Obviously, they're much smaller, and it was easier for the smaller bass to eat, but we really started to recognize problem number one very soon thereafter, and that was the fact that we were just not balanced anymore. So, no, to answer your question, I wish we had introduced threadfin shad. We did not, but we did put gizzard shad in, thinking that it was going to make our big bass bigger. That was our mindset going into it.
And for the listeners, threadfin shad are a good thing to stock for ponds in the south where they can overwinter, which, they tend to die under ice cover, or when water temperatures hit about 36 degrees, threadfin shad don't make it through the winter and you have to restock them. But they're good because they don't outgrow the predator's gape size. The bass can always eat them, even a small bass. I mean, a big threadfin shad is maybe 6 inches long, but rarely do they get that big. They're usually, 3 inches long is a typical threadfin shad. Gizzard shad, on the other hand, get quite large. I mean, I've seen gizzard shad that go several pounds. They can outgrow a largemouth bass pretty quickly, but they can be really important to growing trophy largemouth bass when you have a bass population that can handle them. And most of the time, I don't recommend stocking gizzard shad until 30+% of your bass population is 5 and 6 pounds or bigger. Those are the fish that are big enough to take advantage of them. So in your case, you were getting close to that, but not quite. The gizzard shad got in there. You weren't taking enough little fish out, so you kind of hit that growth bottleneck, and it didn't work properly because the fish weren't quite big enough to take advantage of the shad. And then, of course, gizzard shad, threadfin shad, they'll compete with bluegill. They eat plankton, zooplankton like bluegill do. They'll compete with your other prey species, so that can be a problem. But then you had something much more significant happen that kind of derailed the lake project.
Yeah, we really did. So, clearly recognizing around 2017, 2018, we noticed that the fish the bass they were getting smaller, and there were a lot of them. So we saw that pattern start to evolve because we were imbalanced, and that was problem number one. Problem number two is something that I never imagined to happen. And we had a neighbor across north of us, or actually south of us, but it was draining into our lake, had clear cut many, many, many acres, like 1,000+ acres. There's a small creek that flows into the main body of our lake, and that was a runoff from his property. And our lake became so muddy from that. There was nothing that we could have done to control that. There's not enough hay bales out there that we could have done it. And I'd like to qualify this because we do have, Wes, we call it our muddy season, that just the seasonality of our lake is typically from January until about mid-March. Typically, our water is going to be a little muddy, and it may get very muddy at times. And obviously, the ferns and the brush that's on the embankments around our lake during the runoff, they serve as fantastic filters of the mud, and it keeps our water clear in the spring, the summer, and in the fall. but we're used to having that mud in there. But what was different this time is the fact that it was muddy for 2.5 years. I mean, it did not let up, and that created a host of problems at that point.
And when the clay turbidity washed in, a lot of times clay will bind with phosphorus and other nutrients and bring that with it. So you're basically washing the topsoil of your neighbor's property off and coming down into your pond. And with those nutrients, you can run into a host of other problems, water quality problems, and of course, weed problems. And well, that's exactly what happened, right?
Oh, the duckweed was incredible. So that was the biggest issue that we had encountered. We knew that the muddy water could not be good for the fish. Certainly, it was. We figured it was compromising plankton for the brim and the gizzard shad and other things that were happening. We knew that the balance was going to be off. Now we're on the heels of not harvesting enough fish, so they're becoming, overcrowded with bass relative to the bait population. Now we've got this muddy water. We're looking at it for months and months and months. The span of time, as I mentioned, was about 2.5 years. But this duckweed began to bloom, and it began to bloom aggressively to the point where it took over 75 to 80% of our lake. And you could stand at the levee and look at the largest body of water of our lake, and as my son Will said, it looked like a beautiful golf course. It was bright green and so thick everywhere you would look. And to put it in perspective, I can remember drinking a bottle of water, and I had maybe an inch of water still in that bottle of water. I put the cap back on it. I wanted to just see how thick this stuff was. Not that I was littering. I wanted to just see what it was about, and I threw it into the lake. There was absolutely no evidence that it hit water at all. There was no ring. There was no ripple. You could throw small sticks out there. It would just set on top of it. It was sad. This lake is just so beautiful, and we felt like it was just robbed from us.
A lake that size, it's pretty rare to see duckweed cover the whole lake. I mean, it's usually duckweed is affected by the wind. If there's any kind of wind on a system, it blows the duckweed to the side. So small ponds tend to get completely covered, but bigger lakes usually just have a little bit of duckweed back in the coves. But in your case, you're in a protected valley,
right,
so you don't get the wind like you'd get in a bigger lake. It's a long dendritic lake. It's a very long, narrow lake, almost like a river in some places. So it's a lot more protected than, say, a big lake that's got a long fetch and a lot of wind action on it. But to get duckweed that thick was really unusual. And, so now you've got muddy water, which is probably, before the duckweed shows up, the muddy water, one, it's going to affect the productivity of the system because you're not getting the phytoplankton blooms that are required to create zooplankton because the sunlight doesn't penetrate. You're already not harvesting enough fish, and kind of hard to catch a sight-feeding fish when the water's muddy.
Right.
And you probably fished less because it was less aesthetically pleasing.
Fish.
Yeah. So you got this whole hurricane of things happening at once where your fish were being shaded out by the turbidity. They weren't being harvested. Then they were shaded out by the duckweed. This lasted for 2.5 years. So that's kind of the perfect storm of problems in this lake. I don't suppose you had any opportunity to take anything out on your neighbor, did you?
No, we didn't. We didn't. And he flipped the property. He sold it as fast as he cut the trees, unfortunately. But that's a different story.
Well, but that could be good. I mean, if the new owner is ecologically inclined, they're hopefully going to let it grow back up, and you'll get that cover. Is that what they're doing? We hit the jackpot with this gentleman. He definitely knows what's going on. He's very responsible, and he's a fisherman as well. And he's built his own lake since then, and I think he's doing it the right way. So we have no issues with him at all. Side note, just for a second, it's funny. When you learn something new and you start to see it all over the place. One of those scenarios, and I can remember struggling, trying to figure out this duckweed. How are we going to control it? And being on several flights with work and just flying across the Southeast. And I would look, every time I had a window seat, I'm looking out and I see all these ponds everywhere, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama.
Duckweed are in so many ponds, and it's like these bright green spots, and you know good and well that's not water, that's duckweed. I had no idea that it was so much. And to your point, it is so rare to see it in larger lakes. I observed that. You can also look at snapshots of Google Earth and zoom and look at different lakes all over the place. You'll see a pattern of it in smaller lakes. It was really fascinating in that. And as I was beginning to research this and going to Google and chasing down articles, I never found any examples out there of what to do with duckweed in a lake larger than, well, really a 4 or 5 acre pond. The case studies were not there. We had no algorithm to go by of what to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Google Earth. I actually enjoy just doing Google Earth exploration and looking at all the lakes, because as you fly, like you say, one of the things that always strikes me is that you could be looking at 10 ponds and lakes at the same time, and they're all different colors.
Yeah.
It's the most amazing thing. People think, oh yeah, well there's one way to manage a lake and all lakes are the same. No, lakes are very different, even within the same watershed, even within the same geology. You know, one lake will be black, one lake will be brown, one lake will be green, one lake will be almost blue in color, one lake will be covered in duckweed. Even with on a single property, it makes you realize, hey, you know, every lake is different. Every lake doesn't even have the same potential for management than the lake that could be next door.
Absolutely. And, you know, you're bringing up another point. I think Mother Nature and God designs it to be completely different. I have identical twin girls. They're only identical in how they look. That's it. They're so different. But we have a comparison pond. It's 7 acres. You've seen it. It's also on our property. And my dad built that as well. And we hesitated in addressing the duckweed in the larger lake because I watched that 7 acre pond get covered in duckweed and then it all disappeared. It just went away on its own. We didn't spend any money. We didn't do anything. And I think it was years later before I realized that the way that our drainage system is in that particular pond, it just overflowed into the pipe and went out. The pipe that we have on the larger lake is custom in design where it actually draws water from a depth of about 10 feet. And that's, and you could explain it better than I certainly can, but I think that's to manage the oxygen levels in case we have a large rain and it doesn't have a flip that occurs. But it's not as conducive in that larger lake for that duckweed to wash out like the little lake. But we didn't have that knowledge, and goodness, that's still a theory. It's not proven what I just said.
So many things could have gone on with that small lake. Duckweed thrives under certain conditions, and when those conditions change, something else thrives. And, you know, it's called duckweed for a reason. Ducks do like to eat it. So if it's not having its explosive bloom, then, you know, things are eating it. It washes out, it dies, it settles to the bottom, it's replaced by other things. So yeah, I mean, every lake's different and they're not static. They change through time. In fact, we oftentimes, when I'm talking to people about having problems like a filamentous algae bloom or a duckweed problem, I often describe what I call a state shift. You want to affect a state shift in that lake to where you shift it from a filamentous algae problem to a phytoplankton bloom. It just suddenly switches something. You flip a switch and things change and a different type of dominant plant takes over. So now you've got this 35 acre lake with a bad duckweed problem. I think this is where we met. We had a mutual contact that contacted me and said, hey, can you help these guys? I recommended for you to inject the entire lake with fluoridone, which is not cheap.
No, it's not cheap at all.
No, I think fluoridone is running about $2,000 a gallon, $1,500 to $2,000 a gallon, depending on what brand you buy. And usually it's injected for duckweed. If my memory serves, 1 gallon treats about 4 acre feet. So you've got a 35 acre lake that's probably averaging at least 10 to 15 feet deep. We're talking about a lot of acre feet.
Yeah, even a little deeper than that on average. I want to back up just for a moment because before you and I met, I was lost into, Google searches, as I had mentioned, and I really didn't find any analogs that would have helped us that size lake. Well, I called other biologists before your name hit my radar, and they even advertised, we will take care of your weed control, 100% guaranteed, no matter how many applications it takes. Well, I called those guys and many of a couple of their competitors. Nobody wanted to touch it. Nobody wanted to touch this lake. And it was so disheartening. And then a mutual friend of ours introduced us, and you were the first person to recommend that herbicide to me and the benefits of it. But yes, we doubled down on that. My brother and I applied it in July. I remember it was the very 1st of July. And about 120 days later, we had our lake back. For the first time in 2.5 years, we had our beautiful lake back. It was back in action. And it was interesting because in the beginning it was like watching hair grow, right? It's just such a slow process. And you kept encouraging me, be patient, it's going to flip. And we started to watch that green, as my son called it, the golf course, the fairway. It started to turn a little bit white over time. And I can remember after about 2.5 weeks, it started to turn white, and it eventually would just sink in pockets. But it wiped away that and other subsurface weeds that we had in certain areas of the lake as well. It really cleaned it up. We couldn't have been more pleased, and it did it at a very healthy pace for the fish.
Yeah, when I recommend Floridone to people, I usually tell them, look, it takes time. 30 days from now, you might start seeing a little bit of color change. And 60 days from now, you're going to start to see some real results. And at 90 days, it's going to be mostly gone. And by 120 days, you've got your lake back. Yep. And, I actually was on the phone with a woman that I recommended Floridone to not too long ago. And she called me again, 30 days later. It's been 30 days and I don't see a difference. And I said, well, ma'am, you've got to wait. 60 days is usually about the time I start seeing a difference. The way Floridone works is it basically inhibits photosynthesis. It's not a poison to the plant. It doesn't just simply kill the plant instantly. There are things we recommend now that you can spray directly on it. Diquat, flumioxazin, spray that directly on the duckweed, kills it pretty quickly. Problem is, you got a 36-acre lake, got so many nooks and crannies and coves, and there's no way you could get into this lake, all 36 acres, and hit every single plant of duckweed like that. Because if you leave 2 or 3 plants, that's enough for it to return pretty quickly. But the Floridone, you inject it in the water. So you simply, I've got video, I believe, of you riding around in the boat, right, injecting this chemical behind the boat as you went, using the prop wash to mix it up. And you just sort of did a zigzag pattern around the lake, going into every cove, injecting this, and it slowly will spread. You need to reach a minimum concentration of about 45 parts per billion, and then keep that concentration up for a minimum of 60 days. So you don't want to do it when you got a lot of flow through the pond. You don't want to do it when it's flooding. It's best to do it in the middle of summer when we're in a drought. That's a good time to do it. But it kills it very, very slowly. And the great thing about killing any plant slowly is it breaks down very slowly. So when you kill plants all at once, you run into oxygen problems. And I've never had a fish kill occur when I've recommended Floridone. Floridone's a wonderful chemical. It's just really, really expensive. That's the big problem with it. That's why I don't recommend it more than I do.
Yeah, it's expensive. But, and there's a big but behind that. If you have your typical deer hunter, fisherman that owns property, they're going to spend money. I spend money. We invest time and money on our fields for our deer, right? I mean, we're going to go out. We've got seasonal work that we've got to do. It's a 1, 2, 3-step process. It takes time and it takes money. We need to have the same mindset with our lakes. And there are things that we can do every month from like March until October, November timeline to manage these lakes. And it does cost money, but it is truly an investment. And had we had the knowledge prior, I wouldn't have had to have spent that much money on the herbicide. There were things we could have done much sooner. We could have used something less expensive for a topical application instead of the more expensive systemic shotgun approach that just took care of everything in the lake that was a problem. So money is a factor, but there's management investments that we can do as well that does cost money, but in the long run will save.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's W-E-S, .Neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's M-S-S-T-A-T-E, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show. So, you took care of the duckweed. I think I came over to your property maybe 120 days after you injected the fluoridone. It was a clear lake. There was still some residual, what I like to call the duckweed slicks in the backs of the coves, where there's a little tiny bit of translucent duckweed floating around and some oily sheen on the water where it's still finally finishing up. But I brought the electric fishing boat over and we sampled your lake to see what was the status of your populations after this 2.5-year hiatus in fishing, turbidity, duckweed coverage. We shocked the whole lake, and what we found was that you were still kind of bass crowded, a lot of small bass. The bass weren't very big at all. They weren't very thick at all. And numbers of fish were kind of down in the lake. The productivity of the system had sort of been hit pretty hard by 2.5 years of this problem. From there, we shocked the lake. I made some recommendations on bass harvest and some other things. So let's talk about the management now of what it looked like when we sampled it versus what it looks like today. I guess that was in 2022 I was over there.
It was November 4th, 2022. I'm actually looking at a picture right now of what was in the ice chest from what you had shocked up. And one of the things that really stands out to me is the fact that the gizzard shad were the biggest fish that we had.
One thing about gizzard shad that's really strange, and I've never fully understood this, it has something to do with a disease or parasite that gets in the ovary. I forget what it is off the top of my head, but gizzard shad will reach a large size, and once they get big, they essentially stop spawning. So you have a pond or lake full of very large gizzard shad that aren't making any little gizzard shad for your bass. They kind of outgrow and don't produce.
Right. And that was our situation.
Because this is November, there should be little shad out there. All we saw were 1.5 pound gizzard shad.
Right.
And a lot of very small bass. I want to say we found some bullhead catfish too, didn't we? Or some sort of catfish?
Yeah, we had a few mud cats sprinkled in.
So we shocked it. We looked at the lake. We made recommendations. And one thing I really liked about working with you and your family is you do what we talk about. So often I work with people and they invite me to their lake and I sample their lake and I make recommendations and they nod their heads. And then 2 years later, they call me back and they haven't implemented anything at all. And you guys have been so great about following recommendations. Oh, I remember the only thing you haven't done.
I know what you're about to say.
Well, we did talk about putting in maybe a bait fish pond at one point in time. And we looked at some sites, but that hasn't been done. But that was also sort of a pie in the sky kind of idea.
Yeah, it was.
But as far as management, you've pretty much done everything we've said. You've continued to stay on top of the duckweed. It's not totally gone, but now you know when you see it in the back of a cove, you can get on top of it early with a foliar spray and keep it under control versus letting it take over and have to reinvest in the whole lake application. And so you've been really good about that. And then the reason why we're doing this podcast is like just a couple of days ago, you sent me a picture of what the lake looks like now. And the bass are looking much better. You've been harvesting these fish for 2 years now. So tell me, let's talk about what you've been taking out, what your target goals are, and whether or not you've reached them.
Yeah, we haven't hit our goal yet, but we really like the momentum. We like the pace that we're on right now. So you were there in November of 2022 to shock it after the duckweed, right? So we went into the winter, and then we unfortunately went into our muddy season, as I described earlier. We came out of it in 2023, probably around the 1st of March. And we pulled out approximately 1,000 bass that calendar year. Also in that same spring, though, while we were pulling the bass out, we restocked the lake with 500 brim per acre. We also put in 2 loads of threadfin shad, the smaller shad as you were talking about. I don't remember how many 2 loads are. I want to say like 12 to 14,000 fish approximately. And then we also began to fertilize the lake, and that was a learning curve for us as well. There's a little bit of an art to that. One of the guiding principles, and I'm going to ask you to clean this up if I misrepresent this, but whenever the clarity, every 3 to 4 weeks we would check it, and if the clarity was beyond 22 to 24 inches, we would fertilize it. We then shifted to a herbicide, and we went back to the Diquat, the topical, less expensive herbicide for the duckweed, and just as we would see it, we would just spray it, just spot check it. And it was every other month. We probably needed 20 to 30 minutes worth of spraying, and it wasn't much more than that throughout 2023. We noticed the brim population really began to explode, coupled with the fertilization that we put in there, the threadfin shad. We would see them feeding on the surface, especially in the evenings in the summertime. So we were very encouraged that 2023 was going in the right direction. We noticed a little bit of weight put on the bass, but it wasn't instant. Wes, in fact, we were a little disappointed at the end of that first full season of being committed to a monthly program. We were expecting a little bit more. But we were also committed and encouraged by you and encouraged by some others, just stick with the plan. It's going to work. We went into 1 year ago, our muddy season was a little longer than anticipated. And so instead of clearing up the 1st of March, it was really in April before that water cleared up. So we were a little bit behind. And so now we're in this year, we're in 2024, this reference point in time. And we were a little bit behind on the fertilization schedule because we didn't want to fertilize the water while it was just muddy. We were advised not to do that. But we put in another round of brim. We restocked it one more time. And we're not going to do this every year. That's not our plan, but we felt like to get it back on track. But we put half the amount, I think 250 brim per acre is what we did. We didn't put any other fish in, and we just started hammering the fish again. We've pulled out, 2 seasons ago, I'd mentioned 1,000 fish in 2023. This year, we're probably at about 650 to 700 ballpark on how many we've pulled out so far. I think we'll hit the goal. We want to be around 900 to 1,000 fish. But we are seeing growth. Like, it is here. For the first time, we're really seeing it. And I'll give you an example. We caught my father-in-law and his brother-in-law. They are machines. They will get out there and fish from daylight until noon. These gentlemen are well into their 70s, and they make me feel like I am an older guy and I can't hang. There's something. They caught 60 fish last week in one morning. These bass, they threw 18 of them back because they were over 15 inches, and several of them were 3-pound plus. And a relative comparison from 2 years prior, I think out of the 700, I don't have it, but I'm going to be close on my memory here. Out of 7, I know the first 700 out of the 1,000 that we had pulled out, we didn't throw back a single fish that was over, say, 13 or 14 inches. And now out of 60, we had 18 that we threw back over 15 inches. And the average size has matured from a half pound to 3/4 pound from a relative year ago comparison to this year. We are 1.5 pounds to 2.3 pounds on average what we're catching. We're thrilled. We are absolutely thrilled with what we're seeing, and considering that we've got the growth in the brim, that we have. We did not see the threadfin shad feeding on the surface of the water this summer like we did last summer. I really don't know why that is. Now, I could see them on my Garmin. I could see these balls of fish on the monitor show up, and I think that's what I'm looking at. But we went ahead and restocked threadfin shad recently as well. We put another 2 loads in there, and we think we're through now in terms of restocking. We hope that we are.
Because you're far enough south that unless you have an absolute severe winter cold snap, the threadfin shad should survive. Usually North Mississippi, you got to restock them fairly often, every few years, because you get that big cold snap. You're far enough south, I wouldn't think that you'd have a winter kill. It's possible, but I wouldn't think that you'd have a winter kill. So as long as you're seeing on the surface or on the graph, it sounds like you've got fish in there still.
Yeah, I think so. And isn't it true, or really it's more of a question than a statement from me, but if it's deeper body of water, it does provide a little bit of a thermal protection for the threadfin shad. And so our hope is that there's some truth to that, because we do have a deeper body of water than most lakes that can protect the fish. What do you think about that?
First of all, it should be a whole lot harder for that lake to cool down because you've got so much volume of water. The water has a very high specific heat capacity, so it takes a lot of cold weather to cool it down. Shallow lakes, they cool down a lot faster. The deeper lake, it should be able to keep its overall temperature should be warmer. In fact, that's something you could follow. You can put a logger out there that will log temperature throughout the year, and then go back each year and look at it and say, hey, do I even need to worry about my threadfin shad? Were we pushing 36 degrees at any point in time? But I really wouldn't think you'd hit those temperatures very often unless it's some freak Arctic blast that comes down on rare occasions. But no, so your fish are getting larger. Your bass are getting fatter too. Well, they looked a lot healthier on the photos you showed me. And you're taking these fish out. You're spreading that harvest out throughout the year, right? You're taking fish out all year long like you're supposed to. One of the mistakes that a lot of people do is they like to fish in the springtime and they like to deer hunt in the fall. So they tend to take most of their fish out in the springtime right around the spawning season. The problem with that is that if you've got bass that are spawning and producing small bass and you're taking out adult bass, well, those small bass can just take their place. You can recruit new fish in to replace the ones that you've harvested. Whereas if you take out fish throughout the year, particularly during the late summer, fall period, recruitment's already set by that point in time. The little fish that are going to survive have survived. The ones that were going to get eaten have been eaten. And anything you take out, say now, October, November, those are fish that aren't being replaced by this year's recruitment. So you're actually probably having a greater impact on the population by taking fish out in the fall than in the spring during the spawning season. So spreading it out like that's a really good idea as opposed to doing it all at once in the spring.
Well, and our mindset also is the fact that the brim and the threadfin shad they're not spawning right in the winter time. So whatever groceries for the bass that are in there now, that's what it is. And the buffet's not getting any bigger for the bass until what, Wes? March timeline?
Yeah, usually about March for you.
Again, you just described, though, our mindset in 2014, 2015, and 2016. We were springtime fishermen, and when it was convenient, that's when we went fishing. So we sprinkled in the discipline, but it's chasing a goal makes it fun, as opposed to not having a goal within a management program. And when you don't have a goal and you don't have a management program, I may go deer hunting and a little bit longer instead of picking up the fishing pole. So it changed our entertainment. It changed our acumen, in terms of what we were learning as well. And it's starting to pay off, but goodness, we had to be very patient because in many ways we were starting over.
You were fishing for recreation, not fishing for management. Now you've got a goal, you've got an objective, and it's kind of the drive to keep fishing.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
A couple other things about the lake that I found really interesting when I was there. It is a unique lake. It's very narrow, beautiful down near the dam. It's wider, but as you get up into the upper end of it, it's a long, narrow, riverine type lake that's several miles long, right?
We have 5 miles of shoreline, but in
Okay.
terms of the actual length of it, I don't really know. It's a very good
I
question.
would say 2.5.
I would say 2.5. In fact, that's what was in my mind. I mean, 5 miles of shoreline, right? That would make sense, it being 2.5 miles in length. And you're right, that lake takes on a different personality. We had a pretty good rain. We had 3.5 inches of rain 2 days ago. And yesterday I was on the lake, and in the larger body of water, the water was still clear despite all the rain and runoff that we had. No problem. You run up to the shallows on the south end of the lake, and it's muddy. And lo and behold, there's some fresh duckweed that blew down the creek in the rain. And so, it's a different personality that's in the lake, and in that southern end and the narrow area of the lake that you're talking about. It's shallow. It's 2.5 feet deep to a foot deep for a long stretch, and it is definitely tucked in the really narrow ravines coming together. So it's not much wind, it's not much sunlight. It's different, but I have learned that we can catch fish in there too. We really can catch some fish different times of the year. There are some hot spots that we're starting to figure out. After all this time, we're still learning where the hot spots are.
So the other interesting thing I liked about that upper end was it's got another population. Electrofishing around large alligators was quite
Yeah.
interesting.
We've got our share of gators.
You did. In fact, the small lake, I remember we actually almost electrofished a brood of small gators, like little 14, 15-inch gators came swimming by the one of the anodes when we were electrofishing. I don't think they have much impact on your fish. They're probably eating more turtles than anything, but it's kind of cool to see them when you're up there fishing.
What's your opinion? I'd like to talk about grass carp just for a minute, and
Sure.
it's actually alligators that are putting this in my mind. As you know, I've resisted the one bit of advice of I need to introduce a few grass carp into the lake, and the only reason that I've resisted that is that we have been very diligent with three fish feeders for our brand. We got the floating catfish with the 30+% protein in it for our brim, and that's one part of our management that I didn't mention earlier. And it's going off 3 times a day during the summer, and I think we're probably going to shut it down this month. And when it runs out of food, we're not going to restock it until the water warms back up. But I have a small pond at my home in Madison, Mississippi, and we had to introduce grass carp for grass problems that we had in the lake. And man, they worked. They went to work. We put 407 grass carp in a 27-acre lake.
Wow.
We may have put too many in there, but I can turn my feeder off in the backyard. I'm wasting my time, it feels like. It is like the old Tarzan movie with the piranhas feeding on top of the water. I mean, the bluegill are chased out of there by the grass carp. But when they're old and slow, I would think an old grass carp would be ideal for an alligator.
Probably so. I mean, I actually have photos from a project we did with paddlefish of a very large, like a 12-foot alligator with a 40 to 50-pound paddlefish that it captured. And paddlefish they just slow swim with their mouths open, filtering zooplankton. So yeah, big old grass carp. I mean, they can move. Believe me, they can move, but they're normally just cruising. And if they don't see the alligator, then I'm sure the alligator could catch them. And you're right too. I mean, yeah, 20 grass carp per acre, which was my rough math on your lake back home. That's a lot of grass carp. That will clean the lake out pretty quick, and then you got to get those fish out. But in your lake, for the most part, I mean, grass carp love duckweed. They won't control duckweed. It just reproduces too fast. And they really like those soft, succulent, underwater submersed plants, things like hydrilla, things like southern naiad, slender spike rush, stuff that they can eat very easily, doesn't have a lot of woody fiber to it. Your lake didn't have a lot of that, if I recall. In fact, the only thing I do remember seeing in your lake was a really unusual weed, was you had these big shoreline rafts of burr marigold around the dam, which was kind of a unique plant for me.
Yep.
Grass carp would probably disturb that, and they would probably eat new growth on it. but they're probably not likely to control it once it's pretty well established. So I don't know that your lake would even benefit from grass carp unless you start seeing submersed vegetation show up.
Well, we have had, and help me pronounce this correctly, is it chara?
Yes.
Okay, chara we have had, and we've noticed it in the shallow areas that we do have before it drops off into 25 feet to 30 feet in depth. We do have some shelves that are 2.5 feet deep and 3 feet deep, and that's where the chara really has taken off. We've noticed 2 summers in a row.
And that's a macroalgae, so that grass carp do love that, and they can absolutely control that. It's also known as musk grass. If you pick it up and you rub it in your hands, it smells kind of like musty garlic.
Right.
They will control that if you have enough fish out there. And enough fish is probably not too many, maybe 3 per acre, up to 5 per acre. But that doesn't grow very big. Chara will grow maybe a foot off the bottom most of the time. So it's not going to get problematic in most lakes. I would be surprised if it's problematic in your lake, but keep an eye on it for sure. If it does become problematic, we can always treat it or use grass carp, but I don't expect it to be a problem in your big lake.
And you had mentioned, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say about 5 per acre?
We normally recommend 3 to 5 for new lakes. And in a lake like yours, which is so much of it's deep water, that nothing's growing there. If you stock 3 to 5 per acre on a 35-acre lake, you probably only have 10 acres or 15 acres that are potential plant-producing areas. So your number is actually a lot higher because the grass carp aren't going to spend time out in the deeper water, or at least not feed out there.
And do you think that with 3 feeders equally spread out in the lake, for example, the carp would not be too aggressive with the brim on the feeders?
Well, I don't think they're aggressive with the brim, but they will definitely come to your feeders and eat your feed because, I mean, that's how they're raised in the hatchery before you stock them. So they know what feed is.
Okay.
They will definitely take to it. I wouldn't, if it were me, I wouldn't put fish out there yet. I just, keep an eye on the other plants and make sure nothing's becoming problematic. And we can always, what we can do is if it does start to become a problem, luckily with chara, usually a copper herbicide is much more effective on that, and that's cheap. So you can treat that pretty quickly and easily, and then put the grass carp in to keep it controlled. But okay. I wouldn't put grass carp in yet until you know that there's going to be an issue with that.
Yeah, and likewise, we were treating it. Was it Curitin? Is that what it's called?
Cutrine. Yeah, that's the copper herbicide. That's a chelated copper herbicide that you would just inject into the water, and that helps with the chara.
Getting back to the alligator just for a minute, I had purchased a floating net, like, just throw your bass in, drag behind the boat or tie to your pier. I only bought one of those, and it did not last very long, Wes, because I was lazy. I didn't want to clean my fish that evening, so I had them in the net, right? And so I went to the camp and checked on everything the next morning. And it was like a scene from Jaws, and where the life preserver's got a big bite mark in it. Alligator went under it and just bit. He grabbed the bottom of that floating live well, if you will, that basket, took it underwater. My rope, meanwhile, it's tied to the post on the pier, and he just ripped the bottom half of that net out. And so he swallowed, I'm sure, net and all the fish at the same time.
We should go jugging for alligators.
Hey, you clear that with the state authorities, and I'm all in.
So I think we've pretty much covered everything that we wanted to talk about with the lake. So what's the plan for the future?
Yeah, so it's like sitting down with your wealth management advisor at Fidelity or Merrill Lynch, and they say, well, what are your goals when you retire? And, our goals are aggressive in this lake because we've got to manage toward that goal. We want to absolutely catch more 3-pound bass than we do 2-pound bass. That's what we want. We want an occasional 8-pound bass in the mix, and God willing, maybe a little bit bigger than that. But the one thing that I struggle with from a strategic standpoint is people say you can't have both, Clark. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. You either can catch a lot of little fish or a few big fish. And I get that. I do, but we're stubborn enough where we want to catch a lot of 3-pound bass, and we want them to be the majority of the fish that we have in there and raise that, double that average than what we're doing right now. So that's the goal that we have. And hopefully, with the management program that we're on now, we'll continue to have a thriving brim and threadfin shad population to make that happen.
And I think that's a very realistic goal. It's the people that want to catch a lot of 10-pound plus bass. They're the ones that I think are wanting a little much from their lake.
Yeah, I agree.
A typical lake can only support so many pounds of fish, and it's going to be a variety of sizes. But, having a lake where your fish are averaging 3 pounds with the occasional 6, 7, 8-pound fish is totally doable.
That's what we want, and that's what we're after.
Well, Jeffrey, thanks for coming on today. I think we really enjoyed talking about your lake, and I hope the listeners learned something about how to deal with these problems when they arise. You've faced several different problems. You've made it through them. You've got them under control, and it sounds like you're on the right track.
Well, we are, and I want to thank you, Wes, because without your guidance, and more importantly, hope and guidance, we probably would have been frustrated and walked away. But I'm here to tell you, as a real case study, and it's still in the making, but there's not a lake that can't be turned around with the right resources, the right guidance. We needed that, and my family and I are very grateful for what you have done for us. So thank you.
Well, I've really enjoyed working with you guys. And thanks for coming out, and thanks to everybody for listening to Fish University. I hope to see you here next time. Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.